Okay. I'm gonna share my screen. Just 1 second. Okay. Good morning to all. Good morning to this final session of the Medici conference. I'm Joaquin Alonso. I'm going to moderate this final session and the wrap-up session also at the closure of the conference. First of all, I would like to explain what we are going to face in this hour and a half. I expect even less. First of all, we are going to have a first keynote speech about our project scientific director, Dr. Joe Cullen, where he will present the main project results, and not only the project results, but the main scientific findings we have found during the last 2 years. Then we are having a round table with two speakers. We will talk. We will see an overall overview of the digital inclusion in Europe and how this sector, let's say sector, have faced the pandemic, this terrible year we have gone through. And then finally we will have the closure act with Ms. June Lowell-Keystone, Dr. Joe Cullen as scientific director, and Professor Daniel Burgos as project coordinator. Please remember that the session is being recorded, and if you have any question, please put it in the question and answers or the chat box. So, moving on to the first keynote, I have to introduce Dr. Joe Cullen. This is the scientific director of the project, and as I pointed out earlier, he's going to present the main project results and the main findings we have had in the project. So, thank you very much, Joe. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Waki. Can you see my my screen?
Not now.
It says screen sharing has failed to start. Please try again later. Okay. Okay, can you see it now?
Yeah.
Great.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Right, so as Joaquin said, I'm going to present the results of the project. And as usual, just to remind people that if you want a conversation, use the chat box or the Q&A box. So this is divided into 6 parts. First, I'm going to just briefly outline, just to get our bearings. What do we mean by results? Secondly, I'm going to tell you about the reach of Medici, the good practices that we have in the catalogue. I'm going to briefly go through what kind of practices these are, what are their features and characteristics, what seem to be the main results of the practices that we've collected, what are the gaps, and some key messages going forward. So to start off with, I'm just going to briefly explain where we are. As you probably know, or hopefully know by now, the core of Medici is a catalogue of 270 now or so good practices of digital inclusion. And there's also a mapping visualization system that allows you to find out where they are across Europe. One of the main features of this catalogue is that we've tried very hard to make it evidence-based. So it's possibly the only, if not one of the few collections, repositories of practices in this field that we've systematically tried to find evidence about the outcomes of. And we did that by developing a tool that assesses each practice in the catalogue in relation to its evidence effectiveness, the extent to which the evaluation has been robust, and secondly, the extent to which the practice can be replicated, transferred elsewhere. So we've done a lot of work to try and make this this catalogue and the practice really evidence-based. So the catalogue is a collection of evidence-based digital inclusion good practices, and I think I need to emphasize that we have a particular definition of what we mean by digital inclusion. What we don't mean by digital inclusion is, for example, a practice or an intervention, an initiative that simply uses digital tools to generally support social inclusion. That's out of scope for our project. What's in scope are initiatives, practices, cases, interventions that try to engage people who are disadvantaged within the digital society. What I mean by good practice, well, we've abandoned the idea, the traditional idea of that there are best practices. I don't believe in best practices, that there's always something that's better than the best. So our definition of a good practice is something that's been successful, something that we can learn from. And as I've said, the core objective of the Medici was to provide a catalogue, a repository of evidence about what works and what doesn't. So we now have 270 cases in the catalogue, and we've classified them on the basis of their evidence effectiveness and their replication potential into 3 groups. Innovative practices that are generally new, they haven't had time to establish, so the evidence base is not very well developed. And they're the majority of cases. In fact, over 70% of the cases in our catalogue come into this category. The second category is practices that have been evaluated, and there is some evidence that they work. And there's about 20% of that type in the catalogue. And the third category is replicable. So this is the strongest category of evidence, cases that there is robust evidence that they succeed. They've been evaluated at least twice. Okay, I'm going to look at the coverage and reach of these practices, and we can see that this is a distribution of the practices in the catalogue by country. And as I said earlier in the previous session, the UK has by far the most significant proportion of cases that are in there, going right down through to countries where the cases are not that developed. So Slovakia, Austria, Luxembourg, Croatia, Cyprus, and Slovenia. And just for comparison, this is the Digital Economy and Society Index, which you may or may not know is a measure of how countries are doing in relation to driving forward digital inclusion. And it's an index that measures 5 things. It's the extent to which there's connectivity in the country, the extent to which the skills, competencies are there to actually use digital tools, the use of internet services, the extent to which these services are embedded in people's lives, and the extent to which public services have been digitized. And it's kind of interesting that the countries that are high on the list of, some of the countries high on the list of the index are the ones that have done little in terms of practices on the ground. This is about the people involved. So on the red bar is the actual number of people within the target group. We have 5 target groups in Medici. So it's the extent to which these target groups have actually been reached by the practices that we have in the catalogue. And it's quite impressive. So we have a total of 17.4 million people who have been digitally included, who have been supported by the practices, the initiatives, the projects that are in the Medici catalogue, which for me is very impressive. Most of these practices are small, but some of them are quite large. So there's a significant proportion of practices that, for example, have reached over 100 people. There are some major projects, for example, the biggest target group reached for one project was 3.4 million, which is a national initiative aimed at supporting digital skills. There's also a lot of staff attached to these projects. There's a bit of an outlier here. So the project with the largest number of operational staff, 26,000, but that's actually the Orange Foundation, which is actually its global staff. So if you take that outlier out, there's almost 8,000 staff been working in these projects. So I'm just going to briefly look at what are the characteristics and features of these initiatives. So if we look at the practices by the target group addressed, we find that the majority of projects are multiple. They're addressing different combinations of people with disabilities, older people, immigrants, young people who are disadvantaged and at risk, and most projects target a combination of target groups, and the other target groups are still fairly well represented. It's striking that the number of projects devoted to supporting people with disabilities only represents 5% of the set of projects in the catalogue, and I'll come back to that later. Disability seems to be the group that is probably most disadvantaged in terms of digital access and engagement. If you look at what the practices look like in terms of the scale of implementation, a majority are regional. They're pitched at the regional level. There's a significant amount, just over 25%, that are international, and I think this reflects the influence and the engagement of transnational projects funded through European Commission and EU projects. There's local level projects that are fairly well represented at just over 20%, and national represents about 12%. If we look at the practices by type of implementation, we've divided the practices into 3 groups. Policies, so these are typically large-scale programs that are part of a national effort, an initiative that has been politically motivated and reflects a political agenda. We have systems that are primarily infrastructure, the development of infrastructure of systems that enable digital inclusion services to be delivered, and services themselves. So services are things that actually do stuff on the ground. And as you can see, the majority of projects are in this category. So they're doing real stuff with real people on the ground. If you look at who is doing this stuff, the main conclusion, the main trend is that most of these are trans stakeholder partnerships, multi-stakeholder partnerships that involve different agencies and actors. Out there on the top, as you can see, the biggest single investor, if you like, of resources and energy into digital inclusion are civil society organizations, community-based organizations, NGOs, and we've seen a lot of examples of this over the past 3 days. It's interesting that the second biggest stakeholder group are foundations, and I found it quite interesting and surprising that the likes of, we mentioned the Orange Foundation earlier, but Google Foundation, Bill and Melanie Gates Foundation, Good Things Foundation, all of these are very major players in the drive towards ensuring no one is left behind. But there's a huge range of actors involved. Ministries at the national level are a significant player. Technology companies, higher education institutions, civic society, those are typically the local authorities, the Camaras, the local agencies, schools, digital inclusion networks, and so on and so forth. The point being that this is a multi-stakeholder field. So what are the outcomes and impacts of all this engagement, involvement in trying to drive forward a digital inclusion agenda? Well, going back to what I said at the beginning, the first thing the point to be made is the evaluation is actually very low. That there still isn't a significant evaluation culture in the field of digital inclusion. We divided outcomes and impacts into three broad groups. First group are impacts for beneficiaries, the people who are actually the target groups that are targeted by the initiatives. And we divided those into two subgroups. So immediate outcomes are changes in attitudes, changes in awareness, changes in knowledge, and changes in skills. The second type of outcomes for beneficiaries of these initiatives are intermediate outcomes, and these relate to changes in behavior, changes in the status and position of the beneficiaries. And then we have the three other sets of outcomes. There are long-term outcomes for beneficiaries going way down the line. There are organizational changes that happen as a result of actors being engaged in these projects. And there are the much broader societal level, macro level types of outcomes. And the bar represents the extent to which evaluation data on these outcome areas has not been recorded. So we have roughly 30% of projects have at least found some outcomes that show the immediate benefits for beneficiaries. Roughly about 60% deliver outcomes that show the benefits in terms of changes in behavior and position of beneficiaries. Only around 30% of projects show longer term outcomes for beneficiaries. Roughly a similar proportion show organizational changes, and less than 10% of the projects can demonstrate outcomes and impacts at this broader societal level. So turning to the outcomes that we've recorded and registered for beneficiaries, the immediate outcomes, which are changes in awareness, knowledge, attitudes, and skills, by far the biggest impact of these digital inclusion projects, interventions, has been on increasing people's digital skills. And that's always been a core agenda in this field. There's always been a focus and an argument that, well, if you want to attack and address digital exclusion, you need to start with the skills. You need to improve the skills base of people who are marginalized from digital society and the economy. Other outcomes that we identified were improvements in the intention to search jobs, the use of digital tools, for example, for job searching, using acquired digital skills to seek more educational opportunities. A lot of people who are digitally excluded also can be categorized as not in education and training. There was a lot of evidence that digital inclusion projects and initiatives improve the soft skills of people, increase their confidence, their ability to work in teams, their sense of community involvement, and so on and so forth. If you look at the intermediate outcomes for beneficiaries, and these are the changes in behaviors, so the transition from being passive, if you like, in the digital economy and society to being an active participant, the transition to acquiring jobs in the digital world, the change from a status of excluded to included, we find that the biggest outcome in terms of the contribution these projects have made is to increase people's access to digital technologies and infrastructures. There were significant impacts and benefits on people's quality of life and health that we found through assessing the evaluation data. For me, a surprising proportion of projects reported that their participants, their beneficiaries, had actually found employment as a result of their skills being increased, which I found surprising. I would have thought it was lower than the 25% that we recorded. If we go to organizational outcomes, these are the effects, the impacts on actors, organizations, institutions participating in these initiatives. And the main one was actually improving the quality and delivery of training services, again, which I found quite a surprising outcome. There were significant benefits recorded for organizations in terms of improving their service delivery. So participating in these projects actually improved the quality and effectiveness and reach and targeting efficiency and effectiveness of a lot of the actors that were involved. Improved technical innovation, improved sharing of information and knowledge was another major benefit of being involved in these kinds of initiatives. And this is particularly the case for the multi-partnership and the multinational projects that are in the catalogue. And moving to the broader macro societal level, as I said, less than 10% of projects actually recorded and found evidence to find impacts at this broader long-term level. And that's probably not surprising because you need to be established for a long time in order to begin to register benefits. But of the few projects we found that had collected evidence of longer term and larger scale impacts, the kinds of impacts are connected with improved policy design, so the capacity and learning to target digital policies much better and much more effectively. Improvements at the national scale and the biggest scale in social inclusion. Increased evidence of employment, again at the broader level. Improved public service delivery through migrating to e-services, and improved interagency collaboration. One of the biggest benefits, and I think an important one, was the extent to which the immersion in digital technologies and tools and immersion in multi-stakeholder projects reduced the silos that you usually get between different agencies that deliver different services. So what makes the practice successful? The short answer is we don't know. We did a lot of quite relatively sophisticated statistical analysis, comparing the different characteristics of the different projects and initiatives we have in the database with things like the outcomes. And we didn't find any real statistically significant relationships between the type of projects they are and the outcomes that they deliver. The type C ones, the replicable ones, that small category that I mentioned earlier, we did find some distinguishing features that make them successful. They're more likely to be national and international in scope, and that maybe says something about the extent to which you have exchange of knowledge and practice throughout the different partnerships. They're more likely to focus on systems rather than services. They're more likely to target multiple target groups, so combinations of vulnerable groups, and they tend to be longer established. And that's not surprising, because in order to demonstrate impacts, you need to be doing things over a significant period of time. The last slide I'm going to present on impacts is quite complex, so you need to bear with me a little. This first table shows an estimation of the number of vulnerable people within the EU 28 in terms of our 5 categories of vulnerable groups. So according to Eurostat statistics, there are currently, or at least in 2020, there were 90.7 million people aged 65 and above. There were 9.3 people, young people at risk of social inclusion and poverty. There were 16.2 million unemployed people. There were 21.8 million immigrants, and there were 112.1 people who present with some form of disability. So that actually makes up a total of 250 million people who can be classified as vulnerable. And that's actually above half of the total EU population. So if we look at some statistics from Eurostat and from the SILC survey on disability for 2019 and 18, this shows the, if you like, the degree of digital exclusion of these 5 vulnerable groups. So the first column shows the proportion of people, according to Eurostat statistics, that use the internet daily or on a weekly basis. And we find that for the total population of the EU 28, 85% of people use the internet. But if you look at young people at risk, you find that 95% of that group use the internet daily. So the digital inclusion, if you take that very simple measure of use of internet, is higher for a so-called digitally excluded group than it is for the general population. For unemployed people, it's 81%. For immigrant people, it's 98%. Again, which is a surprising statistic for me. The disability statistic is quite a telling one, because only just over 50% of people who present with disabilities actually use the internet daily. As I said earlier, I think disability is a hugely significant and important category of digital exclusion. If you look then at some important functionalities that people use the internet to be engaged for, that's the use of the internet to do some learning, use of internet for job searching, the use of online civic participation functionalities, you again find some interesting patterns. So for the total population, only 9% use online learning, only 70% use online job services, and only 19% participate in a political and civic sense online. For young people at risk, 32%, a third, use the internet for learning, 23% for job search, and 19% for civic participation. And quite understandably, if you look at the unemployed, 59% will use the internet for job search. So the pattern is much more complex in terms of the relationship between vulnerability and digital exclusion. And if you extrapolate those statistics to try to estimate, well, how big is the digitally excluded population in Europe, which is the next table, you find that that comes out something like, well, there are 94 million people, according to our definition of digital exclusion, who are excluded in those groups. So 39 million people over the age of 65 we can classify as digitally excluded, but only 500,000 young people at risk, and that's because of the high levels of utilization of the internet. Immigrant population, less than 500,000, disabled people, 51 million, unemployment people, 3.1 million. If you then compare our estimate of how many digitally excluded people there are in the EU with Medici's reach, you found that, well, I think the projects in Medici have done a pretty good job. 17.4 million of these target groups reached. And you could argue that, that for youth at risk, we've covered the lot. There are two main conclusions from this analysis. One is the projects in Reach have done a pretty good job. They've reached a significant number of people who have been excluded and marginalized from the digital economy and society. The second conclusion you can draw is that numbers are really misleading. And we know that even though young people who are at risk of poverty and marginalization, we know, although they use an awful lot of technology a lot of the time through smartphones, it doesn't mean to say they're digitally excluded. So what are the gaps? What are the stuff we don't know about? I couldn't resist using, I was looking for an image for geographical coverage, and I couldn't resist this image that shows the EU 28 with the exception of, and the UK is there in massive red. And if you look at the legend on the top right of the map, you'll see that the UK is classified as recently departed, which which tends to suggest that we've all died and gone to hell, which is probably not far from the truth. But in terms of the geographical coverage, as I said at the beginning, what we find is that there's a huge amount of significant contribution that projects from the UK have made to digital inclusion, which means you're going to miss us people when we leave, or when we have left. And transnational projects across the different countries make a significant contribution. In Belgium, in Spain, and Portugal, the lower levels of engagement of participation are in countries like Slovenia, Slovakia, Cyprus, Malta, Greece, Luxembourg, Austria, and Denmark. So there are gaps. We don't know whether that is because our analysis or data collection, even though it was as rigorous as we could make it, is somehow deficient in these countries. We don't know whether it's simply a matter that the activity in these countries is low for reasons that we don't know about. If we look at the gaps in target group coverage, the main gaps are initiatives, projects, support for migrants, as I said earlier, people with disabilities and older people. But you have to bear in mind that our brief for this project, which was set by the European Parliament, was to concentrate on 5 vulnerable groups. So for me, a significant group that was missing were women and young women, for example, who, if you look at the evidence, for example, young women are much more likely to be classified as not in education, employment, and training than young males. They're much more likely to not have access to digital technologies and tools. So there's a huge gender, I think, dimension which we didn't touch because it wasn't in the brief. And I think the other point about targeting is that there are many nuances and granularities within these very broad categories. So one example is it's very clear that that the Roma community in Europe are particularly disadvantaged digitally. We've done a fair bit of research in this. So I think the broad brush categorization of target groups should be refined much more specifically and should have much more granularity. Another major gap, which I hope I've highlighted, is evaluation and outcomes evidence. It's ironic, I think, and quite paradoxical that a central objective of this project and of the brief we were given was to deliver probably the first repository of practices in digital inclusion that were evidence-based, that had evidence of success. In spite of all the work we did, as I said at the beginning, the truth is that there's no evaluation culture, or very little evaluation culture in the field. Only a third of the projects could provide immediate outcomes. Only 40% could provide intermediate outcomes for beneficiaries. Only 30% could provide organizational outcomes, and only 5% could provide impacts at the broader societal level. And that brings me to the fourth gap, and I've called it lived experience. When you work at this level, in broad brush categorizations of vulnerability, in large scale change, in in trying to estimate digital inclusion at the national level in some cases. You don't have, you kind of miss the trees for the wood. I think Ellen Helsper in day one said something which sounded surprising, which was, I don't care about the digital in digital inclusion. I care about the social aspect of it. And I think that's something that's lacking in the evidence base that we have. So there's an argument that by focusing on the digital, we've been diverted to some extent from the social aspect of dual inclusion and dual exclusion. I think we really need to know more and find out more and have more evidence about how people engage with or not with digital tools and services in their everyday life, in their everyday practice, and how being, for example, on the margins, how not having a job or having a job in a gig economy, how that actually shapes your whole engagement with and use of and attitudes towards the digital. I think there's lots of evidence that people within these extreme marginalized communities in situations have to make choices and trade-offs. You know, do I buy a digital tablet to homeschool my kids in the COVID, or do I go out and buy a chicken so I can feed them? You know, we know very little about how trade-offs operate in these kinds of situations. And we know little about improvisation. We did some research a while back in Barcelona and London and Cluj about how young people in situations of extreme digital exclusion operate and how they survive. And the answer is they survive by improvising. They actually teach each other and pass on information, you know, from hand to hand, from mouth to mouth about skills. So I think we need to know more about how that works, how people improvise with different technologies. And that links to intersectionality. Intersectionality is a concept that looks at the intersections of deprivation and exclusion. You know, what is it like to be female, immigrant, jobless, and lacking broadband, and how does that configuration of intersecting disadvantages affect your life? And again, we know little about that. So the key messages from all this, I have 4 of them. So firstly, we need to build an evaluation culture. You know, as I said, this evaluation culture is very poorly developed. It's hard to get evaluation going. People are afraid of it. People tend to think they're being judged as if they were in school. But without the evidence to show what works, for whom, and in what circumstances, it's very hard to deliver policies that are effective. So I'd like to see a new improved evaluation culture. I think more investment needs to be put into providing services to do that, training, consultancy, and so on. The second one I've put as less DESI and more life world analysis. DESI, as I showed earlier, is the Digital Economy and Society Index. I would hate to be misunderstood here. I'm not suggesting that DESI isn't a very important tool, because it is. It shows progression at country, at national and transnational level towards achieving digital inclusion targets in key areas like connectivity and skills and the delivery of e-services. But what I'm saying is, to some extent, we've become a bit too fixated on the statistics at the national and trans-European level, and we're neglecting what's happening on the ground in the life world, in people's lived experience. So what I'd like to see is a rebalancing between collecting the important information that is required at DESI level and nuancing that and drilling deep down into the real experiences of real people in real situations. And then I think we know more about what works and what doesn't. And I think we need more multi-stakeholder initiatives that include the vulnerable groups themselves. So there's a tendency to do projects, initiatives that do things to people rather than with them. What I'd like to see is a transition from top-down, transmissive types of projects to co-design, to getting people who are digitally excluded actively involved as architects of their own future. And in order to do that, I think we need much greater use of what I call design thinking, co-production, co-creation, doing stuff from the user perspective and from the user life world in order to come up with solutions that are out of the box, but nonetheless work. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and any questions would be very welcome.
Thank you, Joe. We're a little bit behind schedule right now.
Oh, sorry.
So, but we have time for at least one question. Kate from Scotland asks, what in your view is the reason that people with disabilities are not being reached by the projects?
That's a really complex question. I think on the one hand, disability rights is not sufficiently embedded in mainstream society. There's been a struggle for a long time to embed and operationalize disability rights across all sectors of society. It's still nowhere near embedded, for example, in schools, in higher education institutions. So it's the kind of hidden problem. So I think structurally that's the main reason. I think there is less understanding of how digital affects the lives of people with disabilities. Most of the effort has gone into obvious things, such as making web platforms accessible, using assistive technologies. But I think broader issues have been more neglected. So, for example, how you navigate around your community, if you have sight loss, is something that isn't really touched very well. And digital tools can make such an impact. For example, if you have apps using geodata, satellite technology, you can do lots and lots of stuff. But we've only scratched the surface. I think it's a combination of structural issues, lack of understanding, and lack of innovation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joe, for your speech. Right now, I think we should move to the next part of the session, to the roundtable, where we have already two speakers in the screen. First of all, I would like to introduce Professor Achilles Cameas. He's professor of Pervasive and Mobile Systems at the Hellenic Open University and chair of the board of All Digital Association. He has an impressive scientific track record, including a vast experience managing European projects and programs. Later on, we will have Mr. Guillem Portes. He's the deputy president of the Spanish association Somos Digital. He's currently running the e-inclusion area at the Fundación Split here in Spain. And he's also the current coordinator of the Connecta Network, a private network managing digital competence centers. So I'm giving the floor to Achilles Cameas. I think you want to share your screen.
Good morning, Joachim. Good morning, everyone. And thank you I'd like to thank you for having me in this very nice event you are organizing. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, let me run the presentation. You have a very nice project there, the Medici project, and We really hope that you will continue the work beyond the end of the project. All this impressive collection of good practices that you have collected will be really useful for the community. And I really enjoyed the presentation by Professor Cullen and all this very useful information that and experience that he communicated to us based on the findings of your project. I am, as you already said, the chair of the board of All Digital, and in this capacity I am participating in this conference. Already some of our members have uploaded presentations to your platform, and we'd like to continue this sort of collaboration. Now, in my presentation, I have prepared an overview of some findings of the COVID, of researches that were done during the pandemic, and some policies that might help us continue after the pandemic is over. Many of the things I have prepared already can be associated with what has been presented before. I will not say all the time as Professor Cullen said, but you will understand, you will see that there are obvious ties. Now, I'm starting being a professor myself. I'm starting from this that you've probably seen, and this is the map of what was the effect of the pandemic on education during the first wave last spring, 1 year ago. And as you can see, more than 90% of the schools and educational institutions all over Europe had to close during this period until the end of May, and gradually then reopened. And many of these institutions faced a series of issues, which started from providing access to the students and ending up to how we are going to do the exams if we are closed. Different strategies were employed, starting from cancelling the exams, for example, up to doing the exams online or in a hybrid way or this and that. But this pandemic brought us in front of some hard decisions to be made. During the closure of the schools and from a report by the United Nations, we see that the most popular, let's say, means used to continue with providing education and training services was to use online means. In Europe, for example, this in all grades of education reached 100%. In the other continents was a bit lower, but still in 3 major continents was over 75%, which is quite high. And this was, let's say, a forced digital transformation of education, which, well, the pandemic affected a huge number of students, about 1.5 billion during this, let's say, hard period of the first wave. Students who were not able to access schools, who were not able to, most of them were not able to access education services, and education services, not only training and teaching, but also services that go with them, like providing meals. And this created quite some problems to students coming from lower income families. According to a study done by JRC, there is going to be what they call a learning loss. It's already been experienced, and this will affect also the future. We will see the effects in the coming years, because students, when confined at home, they tend to spend less time in learning. Of course, they are distracted by the environment, but also they develop a high level of stress because they don't know how to use probably some of the platforms, because they don't know how to manage the time, because they are not in an environment that allows learning, that supports learning, but it's an environment that has been designed for different activities. And also this technology mediation changes the way the students interact. We know that modern theories of learning are based much on interaction and collaboration, and this is not possible via technological means as it is possible in the natural environment, the natural setting. And also all of these factors lead to a lack of motivation for learning from the students, which again amplifies this vicious circle. And while we have these results for the general students, the general student population, it seems that students coming from the lower socioeconomic strata of the society will be even more affected, as the parents, they cannot afford to support them at home, or they don't know how. So there is not enough parental support, and there is not enough resources that are allocated to support them at home. And you can see to the right corner, the same study identifies that the lack of digital skills of the students is one important factor that will impede their future learning. This study, a study done by the European Commission as part of the preparation of the Digital Education Action Plan, collected what they call the unsatisfied needs of all the stakeholders of education during that the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic. Here I have identified in red color let's say the main needs that were identified in red rectangles, those needs that are associated with digital skills or digital technology. The groups are the students, the teachers, the education institutions, and the environment. The rest of them is in the next slide. And as you see, what was identified relates to interaction or being given instructions on what to do, interaction and communication, again communication between between learner and other learners, learner and teachers, learner and the institution, but also the mental health is mentioned as a very important factor. And then the teachers mention more technological factors like internet connection, again, how to use the class material and adapt the learning methodology and teaching methodology. Teachers were not prepared for that. And just going from classroom teaching to online teaching doesn't guarantee an effective method and effective implementation of the teaching process. Again, they cite communication and guidance and lack of digital services suitable for distance and online learning. The educational institutions, again, they cite the lack of digital services and internet connection, again, guidance and mental health and well-being of staff and learners. And the parents, in addition to interaction, instruction, communication, and guidance, they mention easy-to-use platforms. So they, because they had to help their children during their learning at home, they realized that the platforms that are available are not so easy to use. And finally, the public authorities, in addition to financial support, which is kind of expected, again, they mention easy to use, lack of easy to use platform, lack of digital devices, lack of high speed and stable internet connection, a lot of technological factors that are currently lacking. The Council of the European Union came up with a set of measures, summarized the set of measures that were taken to deal with the pandemic. And here you will see that many of them match or map or answer to what I previously said. So what happened was that quality educational content, materials, and practices were adapted to distance. Well, there was an attempt to adapt them to the distance learning context. Virtual learning environments were provided, guidelines and instructions were prepared, professional development opportunities for educators were presented, learners were supported in various ways, also psychological support, also mobility. And finally, what is for me really important is the last one, that there was a need to develop cooperation with local and regional authorities and non-governmental organizations, as well as with businesses, so as to provide a holistic solution wherever possible to these issues. When we go to the vet sector, which was not included in the previous discussion, again, we see that what has to be done in order to continue supporting vet is to offer training opportunities to learners on digital and skills competencies. This comes from a report by CEDEFOP. And also to incorporate online platforms, use high technology, let's say high digital technology, use of simulators and augmented reality, and use platforms to communicate between teachers and learners. And in order to support teachers, as was previously stated, online training modules on digital skills and e-learning pedagogies. This is because there has been identified a lack in the capacity of teachers to deliver education online. These are suggestions on how we can continue after the pandemic during and after the pandemic, guarantee access to internet at a decent speed and make available all the infrastructure necessary, adopt proper virtual learning environments, use different means to broadcast the content. But the second box says that it is crucial to improve the teachers' digital competencies across all ages, and also to make sure that they can use digital technology, they can include digital technology in their pedagogical approach. And finally, to support parents to help their children, as a lot of learning is going to take place at home. Two policies that already have included this kind of suggestions, and of course you're probably aware of them, is the European Skills Agenda, in which we see, among other things, the new set of skills that will be necessary in order for, according to the studies, for the next decade, and I have put them in this red box. We're talking about green and digital skills, the most important ones it seems, but they are also complemented by STEM skills, entrepreneurial skills, transversal skills, and skills for life. So a new education, and education that will follow, that will incorporate the lessons learned and will lead us to the new decade, will have to focus on this, on providing these skills, and hopefully on a holistic basis, integrating all of them. That is why STEM education can be the vehicle to achieve this target. Of course, there are other measures mentioned here, but I will not go into them. And especially for digital education, we have the Digital Education Action Plan, which of course you are aware of, which highlights how to unlock the potential of digital technologies and asks us to rethink how education and training are designed and provided using digital means that will lead to a quality and inclusive education. There are some guiding principles that all of them mention the need for high quality, accessible and inclusive digital education and training. They need to provide access, to guarantee access actually to digital education. And in this way, it will increase quality and inclusiveness. They need to improve the digital skills of educators and training staff. Actually, now digital competence is part of the core skills, of the basic skills that each individual should have. That is why digital literacy has become essential for living in a digitized world. And also invest in lifelong learning, upskilling, reskilling, and in producing high quality education content. And all of these principles have been transformed into actions. There are two pillars in the Digital Education Action Plan. One refers to the infrastructure, the other refers to the digital skills and competencies, and here are the actions recommended actually to be implemented. What is important for our discussion is that there are many recommendations for online and distance learning that there are initiatives to collect these recommendations because it seems that this kind of education will stay with us even after the pandemic. And of course, because of that, there is an initiative to develop also a high quality digital education content, which will be delivered via a platform. And then we need to improve our digital competence frameworks to include modern skills, let's say skills of the modern world, like AI, cybersecurity, and so on, we were working towards a European Digital Skills Certificate, and of course, we need to include students and let's say women in more, to give them more opportunities to upgrade their digital skills and their STEM education. But why we're talking so much about digital competencies? Again, the DESI index shows that 42% of Europeans, they don't have even the basic digital skills, and only 33% have the above basic digital skills. So based on these numbers and all these findings in all digital, we came up with what we call the Manifesto for Digital Competencies. This is a set of suggestions and activities to be taken so as to improve digital competencies, which for us are necessary in all aspects of life because they promote inclusion in the digitally transformed society. You can find the manifesto in this address here in our website, and you can endorse it if you agree with its principles. These are the key principles. We need enough education and training offered for everybody, but we have to make it also accessible to all EU citizens. And it can only be useful if it is of high quality, so it's well designed and measured and evaluated and updated. And we also need a common European digital competencies validation scheme based on the European frameworks. We have 5 areas in the manifesto, one about education and training offered, where we say that it has to be tailored, versatile, and qualified, offered by qualified personnel. The second talks about access to education and training, and we say that it has to be available, universal, and inclusive. The third one refers to quality of education and training, and we say that education and training must be systematic, measured, and recognized. Then we talk about a European homogeneous validation scheme, which can be based on one commonly accepted classification and process, but should include multiple learning pathways and certificates. And finally, sustainability and deployment of all these frameworks. And 2 other activities we're implementing in all digital is towards achieving these goals is supporting the Digicomp online community of practice, which aims to improve Digicomp 2.1. Digicomp is the European framework for digital skills. And now we are improving it in collaboration with JRC and other institutions from version 2.1 to version 2.2. We already started the work. If you want to join, you can go to this address here and fill the application. And the second community we offer is the community that will work towards the digital, the certificate of digital skills that's already previewed in the Digital Education Action Plan. You can enroll in this community by sending an email to this address. So finally, a few words about All Digital very quickly. All Digital is a leading pan-European association based in Brussels and representing about 70 member organizations. Our member organizations work with digital or have digital competence centers that through the training activities help European citizens improve their digital skills. Annually, we serve about 1,500,000 European citizens. Our focus is to support the Europeans who have a sufficient level of digital skills, this 42% I was talking about. So in order to increase their chances to find work and have a happy life, let's say, in our digitally transformed society. This is our website if you want to find more about us. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. At the end of the roundtable. Let me now give the floor to Guillem. Thank you very much, Guillem, for attending our call. The floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me well? Thank you very much, Joaquin, Achilles, John. Thank you for these explanations and all the data you have provided us about the situation during the pandemic and before the pandemic and after pandemic. I don't know how to say it. Okay. Today I'm here representing Somos Digital. Let me introduce first of all this organization. We are a community composite of public and private organizations that we have the focus on digital skills trainings and technological advice to the citizens through digital competences centers around Spain. So mostly we are a community of 13 networks. Okay, so we must represent about 2,100 digital competence centers. Most of them focalize it on rural areas. So we have about 79% of our centers in a small village, in the countryside. And also we represent a community of nearly 1,500 e-facilitators. At the end, we represent in Spain, we have about 2 million of users registered in these networks, and most of the regions of Spain are represented in our community. Well, first of all, I want to introduce my explanation, or my point of view. First of all, I want to say that I have based my results or my answers to the questions that are provided here today in 2 documents that for me represents the situation that we have now in the digital competence centers. The first of all is a researching that we make before the pandemic. It's called Digital Competence Center of the Future, where we make a research with all the networks of digital competence centers in Spain, trying to imagine in this kind of futures digital literacy, where are we going in the next 10 years? Okay, so we do that. We start in 2008-19. And during the research, so we did this research on March. We present the report on March 2020. So at the end, it's something that we were thinking about before the pandemic. Okay, and then the other study that provides a lot of light, well, the situation right now of the digital competence centers in Spain is a study called Robotics that it's all nearly finished, and that it's this study is provided during the pandemic. So we have a lot of the network of telecenters here represented, and we have a deepest insight data about how is the situation at hand and how is the transformation necessary in our centers. So the first question I would like to answer is how the pandemic have affect our daily work in the telecenters. So at the end, we have focused on these 5 points, okay, sorry, that are the strengths that we find in that report, in the digital competence centers of the future, the most strongly points that we have as digital competence centers. Okay, so then we have analyzed how these points have changed during the pandemic. So, for example, we can say that that the capillarity of the telecenters have changed. Sorry. Okay, the capillarity of the telecenters have changed. Okay, that way. Sorry. We ought to say that our capillarity have been affected above all the closure of the small spaces in the most rural areas due to the lack of sanitary guarantees. Also, the proximity have changed because have changed its concepts. We are inside the houses now, but we have not been able to be closer to the most disconnected ones. So in this case, we are more closer, but we are distant from those ones that are disconnected. The trust have been increased with our users as they share new needs, for example, and see us as an important resource of accessing digital spaces. So the trust for sure in this pandemic have increased. On the other hand, well, we are serving almost individual, so customization have been increased, but we are losing this point of community aspect. So clearly also networking has been reinforced by digital resources, or the lesson that digital, for example, fabrication communities have taught us, like all the networking created by coronavirus makers, or all these kind of initiatives that made that digital competence centers have been involved in process of digital fabrication inside there. Okay. And of course, the pandemic also has demanded greater flexibility and adaptation to change in very short periods of time from facilitators. So most of the strengths that we have analyzed in this first report in the digital competence of the future that we make before the pandemic have for sure modified during the last month because of the pandemic. And then I will like also to respond to another question that Joaquin have provided us about which lections we have learned from this situation. No, for example, which kind of practice that we have modified inside the telecenters. We think that we can introduce for a long time in data spaces. So in general, the networks and their facilitators have generated very reactive response because of the pandemic. One of the examples is, for example, all the digital competence centers that have been involved in this digital fabrication process, trying to solve the situation here in Spain where we don't have enough protection for the people from hospitals and things like that. That community make about I think that is now 900,000 models of this kind of EPIs to provide to the hospital. So that's an example of a reaction to a quick response to the situation. For sure, the situation have generate a digital emergency where it has become clear that the digital skills are not longer accessories. It's not something that you can avoid in your life, because most of the reactions of the populations were related with the necessaries to being involved with the e-administration and the necessaries that they have to go to a digital telecenter and to make this kind of oppressors. Okay. The deployment also of activities. Sorry, because I forget to press. Okay, sorry. I can see the presentation. Oh, sorry. Well, sorry, but I can't see my presentation now. Sorry. Sorry, can you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
But you could you put it in a presentation mode?
Okay. Okay. Sorry. So I was trying to do that.
Perfect.
But okay.
Now,
okay.
Now it's perfect. It changed again.
Okay. So what we want to translate, we want to put here in the table today is that we have changed most of the ways that we are providing service inside the digital competence centers. So now the e-administration process, for example, is increasing, and we are reformulating the way that these kind of centers are providing services. So this situation at the end have promote that some regional competence centers have another kind of accords with the region, with the government of the regions, in order to derive this service and to provide it for long term. Okay. So I'm sorry. I will go back to this because I want to. Okay, thank you. Sorry, these points. Okay, so we have an increase of citizen demand for service, a diversification of the group served, but little intersectionality. So nowadays we can find people from different ages inside the telecenters, for example, because of the sanitary situation, and depending on professional retraining process. So at the end, traditional methodologies have also changed it from face-to-face to virtuality, including individual telephone attention, for example. That's one of the new ways that we are providing from these centers. So thank you very much, and sorry for the problems that I have in this presentation.
Thank you, thank you again. Thank you for your presentation. I just have one question. During the last 2 days, well, the questions are for both of you, okay, Achilles and Guillaume. I was saying that during the last 2 days and a half, we have seen the state of play of several digital inclusion initiatives before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and let's see what happened after the pandemic. You have mentioned that we have learned the pandemic, but what measures, actions, methodologies put in practice because of the pandemic do you think that we will remain beyond its end?
Well, okay. For example, one of the practice that we have that the Digital Competence Center have provide is for example the appointment service. Okay, because of the pandemic, we have the restrictions, so people have to ask for an appointment in the centers. So this is one thing that is not gonna be like this for the rest of the life of the digital competence centers, but is something that is going to be introduced in the day of these centers.
And well, first of all, I'd like to say hi to Guillaume.
Hi, Achilles.
It's been quite some time. This pandemic forced the digital transformation of our society, as I said, and many of the practices I think will remain. What will not remain, I think, is all these practices that are not well supported yet by technology, and mostly these are practices that relate to interaction and communication and collaboration. For this, still we saw that the technological level we have is not adequate. But other practices like looking for services or using online services will remain. And I think that for quite some time we will have a hybrid situation in which the digital and the physical will coexist because the digital transformation this period had some negative effects, but also had some positive outcomes, especially from some, let's say, labor or economic perspective. So it is possible. I estimate that the word right after the pandemic will be a hybrid one, and then we'll see what is. Now, the popular term is a new normal, but we don't know exactly what is this new normal. Still, the pandemic is going on. So we're talking, when we say after, we don't know when this after is going to come. And I think that we're going to go for a hybrid situation for some period after.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Achilles. If we don't have any other answer from the chat or the question and answers chat, I think I want to thank you because we have recovered part of the delay. We are almost on time, which is it's great. So I would like to invite the final speakers for the closure part of the session to Mrs. June Lowry Keystone, Joseph Cullen, and Burgos. You're already here. Thank you very much for attending this last session of the conference. So I would like to give the floor first to Ms. June Lowry Keystone, the head of unit from the European Commission. Thank you very much, June. I'm very sorry for the misunderstanding in the time. So please take all the time you need.
No, don't worry. I hope you can hear me, Joachim. And
Perfect.
Yep, good. Okay, so thank you. And I want to thank all the organizers and everyone who's taken part in this 3-day conference. As has been said many times already, I'm sure the COVID situation has shone a very powerful light on our digital and social differences. And the upside of that, if there is one, is that those differences aren't in the peripheral vision of decision makers anymore. They are really center stage. And some, like digital education and access to the online classroom that we talked about, have more political attention than we could have imagined even just a year ago. So I hope, and personally I believe, that we are at a watershed moment, at a real turning point. We think the scale and the impact of the current health crisis, the maturity and the relative low cost of digital technologies, this heightened public and political awareness of the social and digital inequalities due to the pandemic, and the opportunity that we have to tackle those inequalities in the recovery, I think they form a potent combination that can really shape the change that must surely be coming. So the President von der Leyen, in her State of the Union address in September, said, and I'm going to quote her here, "We choose to not only repair and recover for the here and now, but to shape a better way of living for the world of tomorrow. This is our opportunity to make change happen by design." We know that the President herself is very strongly committed to the union of quality that she's aiming to put in place, and those really are, I think, inspiring and very heartfelt words. But that's the big picture. Now coming down to the practical, get our feet on the ground again, what's happening to Medici? Well, Medici is what's called a pilot project, and that's a really unique part of EU budget financing. It's the only opportunity really for members of the European Parliament to transform their ideas or their heartfelt initiatives directly into action. And they are experimental and they only last for 2 years. So to be clear, there is no follow-up funding. But I have a couple of things I do want to share with you as kind of what might happen next. One example comes from my area of work on Safer Internet, where we had the EU Kids Online initiative. Now, the Commission funded EU-wide research on children's use of digital devices for many years, several years. And that funding sort of stopped quite abruptly when the legal base changed and the funding program changed. But a great network had been created. And so those involved, or most of them, chose to continue, that they would continue their collaboration. They would look for other funding to continue national research, so not EU-wide, but national. And then they would share the results and keep the network alive. And that has worked very successfully, and in fact has now inspired a global Kids Online initiative, which looks at research worldwide. So that's one option that really is open to the network that Medici has already created, and that lies really in your hands. Obviously, there will be EU budget funding from different parts of the EU budget. That could be Commission projects looking at equality inclusion, that they are normally published on the funding portal. And also there is funding that comes from the EU, but that is spent by the member states through the cohesion, regional policy, structural funds type pot of money. And the third and really unique opportunity that I see at the moment is to lobby or to investigate with your member state what their plans are for digital investment in the context of the Recovery and Resilience Fund. Now that's 670 billion euros of money that the three parties agreed to last year. Roughly half of it is loans and half of it is grants, and 20% of that is got to be spent on digital investment. Now, again, that really is not up to the Commission what it's spent on, although the Commission has a sort of right of say on the plans that the Member States submit. But the 7 recommended flagship areas for this investment include connectivity, so the fast rollout of broadband services, which I mentioned, in fact, in the chat, modernisation of public health, public administrations and services, including health and judicial systems, and the reskilling and upskilling, and as we've just heard very eloquently, the need to adapt educational services to support digital skills, and also to improve educational vocational training for people of all ages. So those are 3, relevant areas that are flagged already as important areas where Member States should be investing. And the plans also should take into account relevant European semester recommendations. And to go back to the DESI indicators that Joe mentioned right at the beginning of the session, DESI and the European semester might seem all super high level macroeconomics. Now, I am not an economist and I am not an expert, but actually some of those documents are really readable for a non-expert like myself. And there are relevant social and economic indicators and targets set there in that bundle of documentation, including on employment, on education, and on poverty. And of course, last but not least, what you're doing, it's brought together in Medici, but you're doing it anyway. So your individual voices and individual actions at national and regional and local level are what is making that practical and positive difference. And long may that continue. And I really salute all those who are doing that. And I hope that you inspire many others to follow suit. So to conclude, I hope briefly, I warmly thank everyone who's contributed to making the event a success and the Medici project as a whole such a success. Thank all the participants for your genuine commitment to making life in Europe more equal, despite the extremely challenging circumstances of last year. And I wish us all the strength and the energy to continue that work and to make the most of the opportunities to build back better from the COVID pandemic. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, June. Your encouraging words are very, very much appreciated. So I want to give the floor to Joe Cullen for his final words. Please, Joe.
Thanks, Joaquin. I'm going to be very brief because I was the main responsible one for overrunning. So I'd like to echo what you said with regard to June. I was very encouraged to hear that, in fact, there are things out there that might help us to continue with what we've been doing in Medici. And in fact, we're just about to start another pilot project funded through Parliament on digital inclusion for people with cognitive disabilities. So it's very specific. I'd just like to say that I thought this conference has been excellent, and I particularly like to thank our colleagues from DIASIS for their marvelous management and skills in driving this through with pretty much without a technical hitch. We've had 3 days, we've had 9 sessions, 34 speakers, about 500 participants plus 250 more following on YouTube, with over almost 20,000 impressions on Twitter. So I think by any mark that's been a successful conference. So that's me done, I think. Thank you all very much, and for all the participants, all the audience, June, and all of the speakers for helping to contribute to what I think has been an excellent 3 days.
Thank you, Joe. And just to conclude, I want to give the floor to our coordinator, our project coordinator, Daniel Burgos, just to close the meeting, the day, and the conference. Thank you, Daniel. Daniel, you have muted your...
As usual, I'm a little clumsy with these things. Sorry for that. So thank you, everyone. Of course, my address will be even shorter than Joe's. I really appreciate the support from the Commission, from you for being here since the beginning and today, which is really, really appreciated. And also to our project officer, Pavel Dobots, that he's been very supportive to. And the main thing to the users, okay, my address will be focused on that. We've built a nice project with very good methodologies and nice outcomes, and digitalinclusion.eu, which is a lovely place to go and play with and use for research and work. But the community is the key. So without users, all these efforts mean not much. So we need actually people going there and working and trying to find that this effort is really valuable and useful for the daily life and for the future, as Jung was addressing before, okay? And any suggestion is welcome, any contribution is welcome. And of course, this is part of the choral effort of a number of people funded by the Commission to be useful for users, useful for the people in Europe and abroad. So please go there, try to use it, enjoy, and provide us any feedback that you want. Thank you all, and see you soon.